Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from a lovely, pleasant, sunny Neisner. My name is Gino Fransman, and you are attending one of our Influencing with Open Education sessions here at Mandela Uni. Before I go any further, I'd just like to enter into evidence the session guidelines so that we can have an efficient, effective engagement with you all. Please note that the session is being recorded. Have your mics on mute, please. Your cameras should be off, please. They are distracting and they also cause us to use much more data. Please reduce background noise so that you don't miss anything. Your questions, please enter questions into the chat feature so that Prof and I can facilitate getting them answered. We will try and engage with all of these questions at the end of the session, but along the way, feel free to add your queries so that we are aware and we can give them some thought. Follow-up questions can be sent to myself, to Kelly Liberty, or Mlungisi Mhlongo. Those email addresses are now entered into the chat window. Let me put them there. Press enter. Note, recordings of all the sessions are made available on the Mandela Uni webinars and events pages. The link is webinars.mandela.ac.za/LT-collab. Slides used in these presentations will also be shared with attendees, so don't worry. So, welcome to the series. I can't believe that we are halfway in a series of 10 Influencing with Open Education Influencing sessions. And this is week 5. So, Influencing with Open Education is an online webinar series presented by the OpenEdInfluencers here at the LT Collab at Nelson Mandela University. This informative and often practical series of weekly Zoom sessions provide you, attendees, the opportunities to gain more in-depth understanding of open education, open educational resources, or OER, and open practices. You can hear directly from open practitioners here in South Africa and abroad. Seeking to support improved access to education and the resources required for learning and teaching, and aiming to enhance the effectiveness of learning and teaching interventions, this series of webinars also directly engage with the hows of finding open textbooks and other OER in their specific disciplines, while exploring open licenses and their reduced barriers to sharing and using content. Our topic for today, localizing open educational resources, promoting multilingualism through open education. A brief introduction to today's speaker. Jaco Olivier is a professor in multimodal learning at the Northwest University, or NWU, here in South Africa. He holds the UNESCO chair in multimodal learning and open educational resources. He obtained his PhD in 2011, in which he researched the accommodation and promotion of multilingualism in schools by means of blended learning. Before he joined NWU as lecturer in 2010, he was involved in teaching information technology and languages in schools in the United Kingdom and in South Africa. From 2010 to 2015, he was a lecturer in the Faculty of Arts of the NWU, after being appointed as Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education in 2015. During 2012, he was a guest lecturer at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. In 2018, he was promoted to full professor at the NWU. His research, located within the NWU's Research Unit for Self-Directed Learning, is focused on self-directed multimodal learning, open educational resources, multiliteracies, individualized blended learning, e-learning in language classrooms, online multilingualism, and macro sociolinguistics. Sure, I'm so happy I got through that. Without too much more, I'd like to hand over to our esteemed guest and just say before he begins, thank you so much for joining us here today, Prof. Olivier. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gino. It's a privilege to join all of you today. I'm going to hide my video and see if I can share my screen quickly, and then we can start. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a privilege to be with you today and to be part of this series of webinars. I'd like to acknowledge Gino and colleagues from NMU for wonderful work they're doing in terms of OER advocacy, and I think putting it on the map within a South African context. But without further ado, please do ask questions, make comments. This is just an impression of how I see OER's localization can be approached. I come from a background of multilingualism in education, so as Gina indicated, and I've recently done two smaller projects on localization, and I'd like to show you how I see that this can be approached within an educational context. So on my list, on my menu for today, some myths I just want to dispel. Why do we need to localize? Then something along the lines of OERs and multilingualism, localization itself, translation, something around equivalence. Then I'd like to introduce the two concepts of internal and external localization. And if we've got time, just say a couple of things around translation methods and procedures. And then, very important, if you want to start doing this today, what should you consider, and some final recommendations. So myth number one I'd like to dispel is that the internet is English. When we look at OERs, usually we tend to do a search on the internet or on an online repository. And for today's discussion, it's fairly important to realize that the internet is not English, and increasingly not so anymore. Looking at the language spread of the content of websites and the languages being used, there's an increase in usage across other language communities than English, despite the fact that English is quite prominent still. Are all open educational resources English? No, but watch the space. Professor Teller-Meal and our colleagues from Brazil has done marvelous work in creating and also adapting OER for the Portuguese world. And he says that an often ignored barrier to remix and revision is the English language and the Western bias of the internet, and particularly OER. And that's one of the reasons why I'm having this talk today, is that we sit with this hegemony of English OERs, but there's on the one hand the need, but also an increase in other languages being used for this purpose. Oates and Hashimi, who wrote a very interesting article around localization, observed that the issue of language accessibility remains an unsupported and under-researched need in developing the OER movement. And that is, I think, one of the first requests from my side, that after today, you've got a responsibility. Unless if your mother tongue is English, of course, then it'll be fairly easy. But the rest of us, we have a responsibility to see how we can contribute in this regard. Now, an interesting myth, South Africa has 11 languages. Yes, we've got 11 official languages, but we've got a lot of other languages that could be considered minority languages. We've got South African Sign Language, which is hopefully going to be added as the 12th official language quite soon. And if you ask certain people, they'd say in education, we've got one language, and that is English. And that is part of the problem. In order to address the needs of our school learners, and especially our university students, we will have to consider other languages apart from just English as medium of instruction. If you know two languages, then you can translate between them. Now, I'm aware of a lot of initiatives, and even at my own institution, even in my own faculty, where colleagues have gone through the trouble of creating multilingual resources. One of my fellow colleagues in geography actually used students to create videos for geography terminology in their own mother tongues. And the idea is brilliant, and I really do support those type of initiatives. But my concern comes in when that is used as an open educational resource, ultimately, and there hasn't been sufficient quality controls, and there hasn't been a sense created that when you work with language, there are some issues that you need to consider. Translation is not merely, as I would going to indicate in another slide, typing something over in another language. It's actually a complex skill. And in saying that, I don't say that students cannot be empowered to do that. By all means, I think they've been doing it for educational purposes since most of our students have been in school. But to scaffold them towards understanding, and that is some of the things I'm going to touch on later on in the presentation, things like equivalence, translation equivalence, for example. Then a very important myth, and this I encountered even with my own research all the way back from when I started with my PhD, and that was probably more than 15 years ago, that a lot of people say certain languages, sometimes they would even say African languages, cannot be used to explain astrophysics. And if you look at languages linguistically, all languages are of equal value and are all linguistically equally complex. So you can literally say, state any fact in any language. Quite often you might need to describe something, you might need to use loan words, but any language can be used to teach, to say anything about any subject. Within cultural parameters, of course, and hopefully also in consideration of language standardization and those kind of issues. But very important, it's really a myth to say that certain languages cannot be used in certain subjects, especially in higher education. So why do we need to localize? In my mind, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, the hegemony of knowledge from the West and the global North. And this has been stated in a lot of research and publications on open educational resources, where they say this is the great equalizer, the democratizer, a way for us to include more voices in resources and content used in education. Decolonization. A colleague of mine from the University of Namibia and myself did a presentation within the Fourth Industrial Revolution context. We said that openness can actually contribute towards this whole debate of decolonizing the curriculum, which is highly relevant for a South African context. And I think especially one voice, if you look at what people like Jonathan Jansen and Leslie Lagrange are saying, when it comes to decolonization, quite often the voice of the student is ignored. I listened to a presentation yesterday at our university from one academic to the rest of the academics on this issue without any student being part of the discussion. OERs can potentially help there. Something very interesting for me is the whole question of linguistic imperialism or linguicism. Philipson, who coined the term linguicism, states that the dominance of English is asserted and maintained by the establishment and continued constitution of structural and cultural inequalities between English and other languages. That is what we find in the South African education system, from school all the way to university, where you've got a choice between English and English. Furthermore, there's definitely a need for culture appropriate and situated learning. I've added a link here that you can maybe take a look at afterwards in the PDF. And this is a publication that's coming out later this year on multimodal learning and self-directed learning within a higher education context. And in that book, I've got a whole chapter where I explored culturally appropriate and situated learning. And a short answer for my problem that I investigated was that neither our lecturers or our students actually know how to infuse culturally appropriate content, and they are convinced it's not done in any case and will probably not be done. I got gems like, my subject is culturally neutral from that research, and that is totally absurd. The literature tells us it can never be culturally neutral. Any knowledge, any educational context is always embedded in some sort of a culture. And why do we need that? Students learn better in such contexts. And of course, OERs are made to be localized. That's another reason why we should. And in the spirit of open education, if you take it back to Paquette's whole idea of pedagogy ouverte, that it's open, it's that freedom, it's that democracy. So it allows us, kind of from the theoretical basis of open education, for us to include voices of students, for us to include their cultures and languages in the educational context. But we have to consider, and I'm going to touch on dialects a little bit later on. Ultimately, each of us use our own language, and once we start localizing OERs just for ourselves, it might end up that there's no understanding between myself and someone who might be using the same resource as well. To simplify, the whole prominence of Latin as academic language stems from this idea. People in Europe started using Latin, especially in their academic writing, to make sure that everyone understood exactly what they meant. So they had standardized terms for concepts, for methodologies, for whatever they would want to write down in that academic context. Today, our Latin is English. To a great extent, we regard that most people will understand concepts in the same way. So if we do go down the localization route, what English would we use? What other languages would we use? And how do we ensure that people understand each other? But more about that a little bit later on. So OERs and multilingualism, they go hand in hand. Recently, the UNESCO recommendation on OER that was accepted by member countries at the end of last year, it was stated in their recommendation that member states should be supporting OER stakeholders to develop gender-sensitive, culturally and linguistically relevant OER, and to create local language OER. They call it by name there, particularly in indigenous languages which are less used, under-resourced, and endangered. So our governments have committed themselves to this ideal. The thing is, when it comes to language, and some of the colleagues who are joining us here today might also be able to attest to this, we cannot sit and wait for government to give another grant for another language to be developed. We're at the point, especially in the COVID-19 context, where it's up to language communities, language users themselves. And I think that grassroots, almost language attitude planning that could take place can make a big impact. An example of initiative is the Open Educational Resource Term Bank. The Term Bank is not about open educational resources. It in itself becomes an open educational resource. This is from a couple of universities in the country who have collaborated to translate key terms in certain subjects. Now, this is a very ambitious project, and I think there's still a way to go, but it's worthwhile to take a look at what they're doing there. I think this particular term bank is hosted by University of Pretoria, if I'm not mistaken, but I know there's a couple of universities involved. Furthermore, we have to build on existing expertise and initiatives. As I mentioned before, I know of a lot of work being done where open educational resources are being created in different languages. In addition, I started off by saying, yes, if you are in education in South Africa, then you are limited between a choice of English or English. And to an extent, that is not really true. To give you some examples, I know of an education degree at the University of Limpopo where they had whole modules being done in African languages. If I can recall correctly, I think they used Northern Sotho in that instance. There's some universities in the Cape where in medical faculties, they would use or include African language courses for the aim of of doctors and medical practitioners using African languages in practice. At my own institution, Northwest University, we've got a foundation phase education degree, which is aimed at Setswana mother tongue speaking learners ultimately, but the whole degree is presented through the medium of Setswana. Where we don't have lecturers who can present in Setswana, we make use of interpreters. And this has been running for quite a while now, with funding also provided by one of the local mining conglomerates in the Northwest, and the Royal Bafokeng Nation, if I can recall correctly. So there are these initiatives that we can build from. Take that degree, for example. They are generating a lot of content, and that can be shared very easily. So localization, I've been talking about it for a while now, but how can we draw the parameters around this concept? Wolfenden says that it pertains to adaptation where content is made relevant on the one hand, but also translation where the text is converted from one language, and very importantly, or language variety to another that is appropriate for a target learning context. It's important for me to, at this point, also highlight that quite often, if we say English, my English and your English might not be the same. I grew up in the Northern Free State, and as you can probably hear, my English was taught through the medium of Afrikaans. When I got the opportunity to go to the UK and work there for a while, I only heard inner city London, which messed up my pronunciation even more, because they talked about water bottles instead of water bottles. So every variety is person, community specific. Which one would one need to consider when you come to localization? Wiley, and you all know Wiley probably, and others say that localization is one of the most important but also least understood elements of OER. And I think that prompts us to investigate this further. How can we localize OER for the South African context today? Localizing OER also pertains to rendering content in other languages, but also ensuring that technology is appropriate for the context. And this we've seen with the COVID-19 context. At my own university, we had to accommodate so many modes of delivery. We even had to generate paper-based resources to share among some of our students who not only not have access to internet, also don't have the skills to access the learning management system through a phone or whatever the case might be. So for a South African context, localizing might mean to also have OER on a shoestring, something that's adaptable and usable in any context. Now turning to translation. Now this is a photo that I used when I taught translation studies. I think that was about 8 years ago for a semester, which was really an interesting experience. Because before that, I only encountered translation studies at undergraduate and honours level. And this is a road sign that was put up in Wales. And it shows you the importance of whoever is asking for a translation to be able to do the quality control, to be able to understand the culture. And my Welsh is not good enough to read that, but I can give you the translation. So the English says no entry for heavy goods vehicles, residential site only. The Welsh reads, I'm not in office at the moment. Please send any work to be translated. This was sent by an automatic email reply to a request for a translation by the local government in some or other place in Wales. And the person requesting the translations, Welsh was not good enough to actually realize that this is not the translation as they thought it was and stuck it on the sign. This was actually just a reply. But this shows you the importance of being sensitive for the quality of translations and all the variables that are involved in the localization process. So is translation typing it over in another language? No. It requires an in-depth knowledge of both languages, content, and the translation theory behind the process. Why? When it comes to ethical conduct, if you are trained as a translator, one of the things that you are usually taught and instructed about is that you need to remain, to an extent, responsible to that message that the source text writer had in mind. Now you can already hear the problem you might encounter when localizing, because your agenda of localizing content might not be the same as the agenda of the person writing the original text or video, or whatever the mode of the document might be. But we as localizers must still have some ethical conduct in the way that we approach generating new knowledge in another language. You cannot amend facts to suit your own ideology, for example. This is a real issue in higher education as things are now. If you look at what is happening with the American politics, where even the replacement of one judge might mean that views on abortion, education, gender might be legally changed. And we are functioning in that context where an American textbook might not be as scientific as you would think. I want to maybe just mention here the whole issue of meta-literacy, and by all means, please Google it afterwards. We need to make our students meta-literate so that they act in a responsible way when encountering content and know how to distinguish between reliable content and whatever might be considered someone's opinion or an ideology. Dialects, I mentioned that earlier. When it comes to especially African languages, not just that we have a lot of dialects, that is also true. There's ongoing standardization processes, and that's true for any language. It never just finishes. And what I mean with that is the standardization can involve saying or selecting which words are actually the standard form that we use for a particular thing. A simple example from Southern Sotho or Sesotho that I studied at school, if you speak to anyone, you would say today is Kasheku. But whenever you write it down, you would write down Kajenu, because Kajenu is the standard version of the word, but it would be weird if you talk to anyone in the Northern Free State and you use Kajenu instead of Kasheku. And there's quite often a range of words that can be used, a range of spellings and grammatical structures. Back to dialects. In terms of linguistics, it's really not the best to talk about dialects because that narrows the focus quite a lot. It starts with us considering that each of us have our own lects, or called idiolects. So each of us will have our own language. Do we start at that level? Do we move towards sociolects? In other words, the kind of language we use in our social groups within our university? Do we look at geolects? In other words, do we use the language, whether it's English or isiZulu, used in KwaZulu-Natal, or do we use the English used across the country? And so it moves up all the way from geolects, sociolects, etc. So that needs to be considered. And I think when it comes to true localization, this needs to be considered. Another colleague of mine, Professor Thabo Ritsele from Tshwane University of Technology, is working on Sipitori, which is an urban variety of Setswana. And if you were to teach at TUT, it might be sensible to use Sipitori as a language of instruction. Quality. So why do we need to know about translation theory? So that we can have measures in place to look at and evaluate the quality of translations. I want to quickly stand still with this concept of equivalence. Now, translation equivalence it's a very common concept in the translation world, but very rarely used when we adapt OER. Now, if you look at Eugene Nida, and interestingly, he comes from a religious translation background, and for them, people translating religious texts, it's quite often an issue, how you approach your translation. In some religions, it's considered really sacrilegious, totally wrong to even amend one word within a sacred text. In other religions, it's more about conveying a message. So that's why he's got this two facets of equivalence that he explains. Formal equivalence, which pertains to text remaining faithful to the source text. So almost word for word. And then there's also this question of dynamic equivalence. And here it's more about the target audience receiving the same message or getting the same feeling as someone reading the source text would have had. So in his words exactly, he says the translation of dynamic equivalence aims to complete the naturalness of expression and tries to relate this receptor to the modes of behavior relevant within the context of his or her own culture. So for us, when we approach OER, it's very important to aim for dynamic equivalence. A simple example, we cannot take a textbook, open textbook from the US or Europe that continuously refers to snowy weather and, you know, I can't think of what animals they might have, but we don't have, but some kind of reindeer coming across the road. That is outside of our context. And therefore, within a dynamic approach, dynamic equivalence, one would choose examples that might be more appropriate or closer to home. This brings me to the whole issue of internal and external localization. External localization is generally when, say for example, a university gets funding from outside to translate some modules or module content into a specific language and then ultimately package it as OER and there we go. So it's something that's done formally, it's something done usually with sufficient quality controls. But I think there is some sense of internal localization also taking place in classes, and I'd like to link that to translanguaging, which I will quickly explain in a moment. External localization, as I said, happens before the learning. It's done by content experts and language practitioners, whilst internal localization is done by students throughout the learning process, and that can be used to generate OER for reuse again. This is typically like the example I mentioned at the beginning from my colleague in geography, where terminology is translated by students, it's uploaded to YouTube, and it's reused again. I'd like to link this with translanguaging. And this is described by Garcia as an act performed by bilinguals of accessing different linguistic features of various modes of what are described as autonomous languages in order to maximize communicative potential. In other words, our students, when they're in the class, they rarely only use the language of learning and teaching, whether it's English or whatever. Quite often, students will code switch between their own mother tongue or other languages used in our multilingual classrooms. This process of translanguaging happens fairly spontaneously, but it can also be planned, and there's a whole field of research being done on this. I can also strongly suggest that you take a look at Professor Leketi Makalela's work on multilanguaging, or in his words, Ubuntu translanguaging. And he's doing wonderful work, him and a group of colleagues at Wits University in this regard. The whole idea of translanguaging is fairly old, and it comes from Wales once again, where at some point they realized that learners at school were losing their capabilities of using Welsh effectively. And for the sake of keeping the language alive, what they did with the original transversal or translanguaging was to divide a week into certain language days. So on a Monday, the teacher would speak Welsh and the students would speak English, and on a Tuesday would swap around. On a Tuesday and the Wednesday, and so they would go along. So in the class, the students would ask questions or respond in one language, and the teacher would respond in another language. And through this process, the students became fully bilingual. And this happened not in a language class, this happened in mathematics and geography and wherever the case might be. So this is the origin of this, and one can take a sense from this and also think, how can OER actually be used as a vehicle for translanguaging in classrooms? And I think that is something that can still be investigated. In my mind, one could follow a process like this towards that internal localization. Preparing and scaffolding student skills in terms of content, language, and translation skills. Then letting the students identify relevant OER, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Forming core groups, and quite often this could be a nice interdisciplinary action between students studying languages and students in other faculties. Localizing, adapting and translating the content. Doing some sort of a peer review, which is also within the spirit of OER. And finally, publishing it openly as OER for reuse within another cycle. The next 2 slides, or 3 slides, I just want to touch on some translation methods and some translation procedures. Peter Newmark, who's also very prominent in the translation studies world, says that there's different kinds of translation methods that can be followed. And I think for our purposes, when we look at OER localization, it'll be faithful translation, or maybe to an extent semantic translation as well, because we attempt to produce a precise contextual meaning of the original within the constraints of the target language grammatical structure. In other words, if we've got content that's originally in English and we now want to present this in Tshivenda, then we need to consider what is grammatically possible in Tshivenda and keep the context in mind as well. Then in terms of procedures, these are more the practical things. So when you are in the process of localizing and you encounter a term, what do? Quite often, transference takes place. We take a word as it is. The word internet in many languages is kept internet. COVID-19, there's no reason to change and call it something else that might confuse people. Unlike certain American presidents who tend to prefer changing the name of that virus for political aims. Then in other words, when we look at naturalization, when you take one word with a certain pronunciation into another language, quite often the other language might have language rules that must be adhered to. But you can see I've illustrated the problem here in terms of Southern Sotho or Sesotho, where the word computer can be written, and this is after consulting a couple of dictionaries, in at least 5 ways. And most mother tongue speakers will immediately know what you're talking about, but there's a standardization issue there. Quite often, cultural words or words with cultural additional meaning might need to be translated with a cultural equivalent. So if I take Lubola and I want to explain that to a Serbian-speaking person, I would have to say, yes, this is Miraz. There's not exactly a semantic equivalent here, but at least the terms mean something similar. Sometimes we have to use a functional equivalent. If I have to say Stockfell, I could say it's an informal bank, but it's way more than that in practice. Sometimes you have to look at the descriptive equivalent. So if you take the term Hlonipa and the language associated with that, you could describe it as linguistic politeness to show respect, but once again, this is so much more and it's so culturally embedded. Sometimes comprehensial analysis must be done where you got something with a similar meaning, And there's not an obvious one-to-one equivalent, but you can at least say, convey the sense, like braai in terms of barbecue as an English equivalent. So in addition to that, there's also synonymy through translation, and then a couple of others, shifts and transpositions. So changing the grammar from source language to target language. Modulation, when you reproduce the message of the original text in the target language text to conform to the current norms of the target language. Quite often there's linguistic reasons why certain things do not work. Certain languages don't have articles. So certain languages have very different syntaxes, and that might have an influence. But also recognize translations. And this is very important for us as localizers to consider that if you do a translation of an OER, you must make sure that you consult works translated within that field already, because there might be established terminology for certain words. And within the translation world, we follow a corpus-based approach here. And most of us have access to one of the biggest corpora in the world, and that is Google. By merely Googling a certain term, you can confirm whether it's used quite often or not. Compensation, sometimes there's a loss of meaning and you have to compensate in another place. Paraphrasing, this preceded meaning of the cultural bound term is explained, and you have to give additional information. And then there's also the combination of procedures and notes, which is also highly possible in OER to explain why something is found in a text and to situate it culturally. So if you want to start today, what should you consider? One of the very prominent South African linguists said, that's Johan Combrink, that 100% communication the first time is our aim with texts. And I think with OERs, it must be the same. If it does not communicate because of cultural barriers, because of language barriers, then you have to rethink the content. We must put the local back in localization. And a lot of authors actually say this, that localization should happen in local communities where the OER will be used. In other words, at the university, in the classroom where it's to be used. And there the students are key. Whose English is isiZulu or Xitsonga? Ultimately, the variety used by the students will dictate this. We need to be cognizant of language standardization processes and move towards contributing to that corpus of commonly accepted terminology. And we do that through openly sharing terminology. Wiktionary is an excellent place to start. All the South African official languages have Wiktionary pages, and you can register and add terminology there. And it's got that inbuilt, typical from the wiki movement, inbuilt peer review aspect that can be used to ensure that the terms are acceptable by everyone. A corpus-driven approach. So if a certain term for a certain concept is used often by most people, then we can say, yes, there's evidence to use this translation rather than another one. Work with experts. We as lecturers, as localizers, must work with translators and lexicographers in the languages that we want to work with. These are the experts. The translators, because they know how the translation process works and they know the two cultures, and lexicographers, because they are creating dictionaries. They know how to create new terms. And we have to consider copyright law, and in South African copyright law, you cannot merely adapt a text from one language to another language or translate it without the permission of the authors or the publisher. So you have to consider using Creative Commons licensing there. I want to finish off, before I get to the recommendations, with this slide of Piwa Nkosi Mbuyazi, who was, this is quite an old article, but basically started creating terms for some of the words he saw around him that lacked standard terminology. And that is what I think we need to become. It's not just open activists, but open and language activists. Some recommendations. Translanguaging with OER should be supported and encouraged in classes, perhaps by means of annotations on OER. Start with your field of expertise in your language. So with your field in your language, what can you contribute? Consider harmonization for resources in related languages. Might be a contentious issue, and I've been reading about this for more than 20 years. There are a lot of South African languages that are very similar. Languages in the Nguni group, languages in the Sotho group. And in the translation for OER in either of those two groups, for example, one can consider keeping terms that might be understandable across language boundaries, if that makes sense. So that if one needs to translate or adapt Sesotho OER to Setswana, that the distance is not so far. But as I say, that is something that still needs to be tweaked a little bit. And I know there's also a lot of emotional issues around harmonization. This was a debate that Clark, who started in 1945, and a former Vice Chancellor of UNISA, Professor Msimang, also wrote about this. And I still think this will at least address some of the issues we have around 11 languages. And then share terminology. And I'm so glad that Benito Trollope has joined us today. SADiLaR is one of the South African resources that we must use. So if you create a whole bank of terminology, share that with SADiLaR. They're the experts in sharing it openly online. And then also use appropriate Creative Commons licensing. That's essential for all of us, because then you know, are derivatives possible from your OER or not? And start locally and in a team. I just want to mention that this is a view from myself and also UNESCO Chair on Multimodal Learning and OER, where specifically culturally appropriate OER is it's an important aspect that we want to look at, and you are welcome to engage us in that regard. A reference list, and then I will give some time for questions, and there's my contact details. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Prof. Can I just be the first to say that that was wonderful, completely enlightening. I learned so much, and well, I also understand I have so much more to learn. So thank you very much for this. Just to remind everyone, you will be able to access a copy of the presentation as well as this recording. Those links are in the chat window. Prof, there are two questions. Well, there's a few questions here now. And I think we go to the first one, which is from Kelly Liberty. And Kelly's a student here at Mandela Uni, who's also an OpenEdInfluencer. And she asks, how do you approach non-equivalence when attempting to translate and localize open specific terms?
That's a difficult question. I think theoretically, non-equivalence is impossible. There will always be some sort of a, let me put on my screen, there will always be some sort of an equivalent term. And quite often, language practitioners must think creatively. And the easiest answer is quite often to use the word as is. If you look at terminology from technology, that is quite often what we do. We don't translate CD-ROM in most languages, we keep it CD-ROM because the concept might be already known to people in English. So non-equivalence, I really think we reach that quite often. It's more matter of us compensating through a strategy like describing something or using the term as is. I don't know whether I answered your question, Kenny.
Yes, you did. Thank you, Aku.
I will go on to the next question, which is actually from a colleague in Mumbai. Hello, Dr. Mahesh Koltami. Would you like to read out your own question, perhaps? Mahesh, are you there? I mean, you are there. Maybe I'll just read out the question for brevity's sake. When we localize any content, according to me with the translation, we have to add local information, examples, scenarios, terminologies in content. But here license issues are raised. What would you suggest?
That's the whole point of having to use Creative Commons licensing. If your OER is licensed correctly, where it doesn't say non-derivation, then usually adaptations are possible. To answer your question of the practicality, I would suggest that you engage with the publisher or the author of that OER and find out, is it allowed for you to do that? There's also ways around this to have additional supplementary material that pertains to local information and examples. But yes, you cannot localize only at the level of language. That is just purely called translation. That is done, and it's got its place. But when we localize OER, it needs to pertain to the content as well. And here we have to encourage colleagues, people generating content, to use the correct Creative Commons licensing. But Dr. Mahesh, I know in India you've had a couple of interesting legal issues around being able to copy and adapt content. So I would think that fairly soon, looking at the trend or the trajectory of the legal or the copyright issues in India, it might happen that this might not even be a problem. So yes, I don't have a short answer for you, but it would be Creative Commons licensing, and if not, having additional material in conjunction with that material that cannot be adapted. Yes.
We have another question, and this one's from Lungisi Mhlongo. Lungisi is also one of our OpenEdInfluencers here, and has also been, along with Kelly, trying to get some of these, the open specific terms translated for our use in our projects as well. So they actually ran into some challenges, and I think that's where Kelly's initial question came from. Lungisi, would you like to ask your own question, please?
Yes. Could maybe localizing OERs become an issue when considering that in South Africa we have different cultures, like in a student environment? How do you cater for these different cultures and languages and backgrounds when we're trying to localize the content?
Thank you for a very good question. Yes, that is one of the key issues we have in South African education. Even at school level, quite often this is posed as a reason why we should stick with English. Short answer, OER would actually allow you to adapt how many versions you'd need. Yes, it is a problem. Say, for example, you've got one student in your class who speaks a certain language and there's no one else. Then it might become a problem because you cannot even create a group around that person to create OER. But I would think making use of your students as resources. They know best what language variety is appropriate for them. They know best what their needs are. That's why I mentioned the harmonization question or issue before. Quite often, students know so much about languages related to their own mother tongue. For example, within the Nguni language group or within the Sotho group, that they wouldn't mind contributing to isiXhosa resource and not having a separate one in isiZulu. So it's part of a negotiation process with your students. But the key is here, students. Technology allows us to accommodate more than one language within a classroom. If it's the lecturer, that's the only lecturer, and you can only stick with the language that the lecturer uses. But if you're using OER, you could have umpteenth number of versions. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof. There's what looks like a comment right now. So maybe I should ask Ms. Matilda Smith, who's the director of the law clinic here at Mandela Uni, and who's also part of the Open Education for a Better World contingent now in 2020. And maybe she would like to just introduce herself and speak about her own project, which is plain language for legal terminologies and having that translated for people here in South Africa. Matilda Smith, would you like to step in, please? Am I putting you on the spot?
Thank you, Gina. So I am the director at the Law Clinic at Nelson Mandela University's Law Clinic. We operate in an area where we not only have multiple languages, but also pluralism. So we have different cultures using different legal systems. I think somebody called it a bubble tower problem. So what my project was looking at just focusing on our local languages, Afrikaans, English, and isiXhosa, in trying to assist our students who also work with clients. So in the law clinic, and assisting them to be able to explain legal concepts to their clients in the language that their clients use. So you first need to have the problem of having the students understand it and then translating it. An issue that we have found is that when linguists do the translations, what we end up with is not quite the same as the legal concept. So you need somebody who is both a lawyer and has the linguistic abilities. And then of course you need them not to use legalese, which I consider to be yet another language, particularly when it needs to be explained to clients. So my question is, how do we deal with this in a way that is not too expensive, and also in a way that makes it accessible to both students as well as members of the profession and clientele? Because what we want to do is make it open and available to paralegals and advice officers as well as our students.
Thank you. Yes, that is also a very interesting question, and it's a tricky situation. And it's not, I think, only limited to the legal context. The two things that come to mind for me is, first of all, pivot translations. Now, you work within the field of plain language for legalese, and I think you have to pivot between English, plain language, and ultimately, say, for example, isiXhosa, I would presume. What I mean with that is, one shouldn't give that original legalese to the translator, but pivot first to plain language and then let that be translated. Now, pivot translation is something that we get, especially in the world of subtitles, for example. The only way that one can subtitle a Korean movie into German is to get the Korean movie to be translated into English and then from English to German, because there's no expertise that can cross those two boundaries. So I think something along the lines of using some sort of a pivot, some additional step in between where you can simplify the language and then work with the translator towards a more effective version of or target text. The other thing is, you also mentioned specifically the people who will be using this. Aren't there perhaps people in the field in practice who could contribute in this regard? Within an open philosophy, we rarely say, yes, we've done the textbook, it's done, we've printed it, and now we can sit crossed arms. It's always a work in process. And that's why I particularly mentioned Wiktionary. Any type of wiki situation where you can build on it and work on that translation for it to ultimately become functional and appropriate for your context would be my suggestion. And making use of the resources at hand. The students who are mother tongue speakers and who are also becoming content experts, but they can still make a judgment whether this is correct or not. So let the translator do the initial work, but then let the students refine and work with that text. And if possible, but I realize also that outside people in practice have got their own work, but like that example I showed you, there are a lot of individuals who, for the love of the language or the issue, will put time into refining this. And something like Wiktionary is for me not something that we're going to finish within the next 5 years. This is something that one can build for over 50 years. This is part of a longer language corpus planning process. So I would think between pivot and between having an extended process, and maybe we can engage afterwards, because I'm also very interested in plain language. I always, my colleagues look at me when I say we have to think in terms of research. If our research is never presented in plain language as well, we've wasted a lot of government money. And people just think, no, the research is done, it's been done. But there's something to be said about that as well. So I hope I've given you an idea, although not maybe a solution.
No, thanks. I'll definitely look at the pivot issue. I didn't consider that before. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Prof, and thank you, Matilda. We've reached the end of our session. Like I said before, when we started out, please do reach out, engage with us, engage with Prof. Olivier. I've put in his contact details into the chat window. Let me just, before we go, tell you something about next week's session. This is week 5 in a series of 10 webinars held weekly each Wednesday in the Influencing with Open Education series. Note that our week 6 session is again set for next Wednesday on the 30th of September in the same time, so 1 p.m. SA time. The session features Dr. Robert Farrow, who is an interdisciplinary education researcher in the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University UK. Dr. Farrow was also my mentor in 2019 and 2020 for the Open Education for a Better World program, which is also another UNESCO initiative. I put the links for both Matilda Smith and our Open Education Influencers projects into the chat window so you can explore at your leisure. As one of the heads for the Open Education Research Hub, or oerhub.net, Dr. Farrow works with a range of international partners to research the theory, delivery, and impact of open educational resources. Dr. Farrow, in this session, introduces the Global Open Educational Resources Graduate Network, the GoGN, of which I'm also a member, and shares outputs like the collaborative publication of a postgraduate research methods handbook, published recently in 2020. Trust me, it's something that you want to see, something that you definitely want to point your postgraduates and staff researchers towards. And I'd like to say thank you from all of us here to Prof. Olivier. If you'd like to say a few words for goodbye, I'll hand over to you, and then everybody can just log on quickly and say goodbye. It is the day before Heritage Day here in South Africa, and I'm so happy that we are speaking about promoting multilingualism through open education. Prof. Olivier?
Thank you very much.
So thank you, everybody, and stay safe and have a wonderful long weekend if you are in South Africa, and wherever you are in the world, stay well. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.